Hi, welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Zach,
And I'm Rin.
and today we are joined by a very special guest, Mary Adkins. Mary is a former lawyer and Yale Law School graduate who has into a writing coach through helping other authors develop their skills, and she's also published through HarperCollins. She's the podcast host of the First Draft Club, and she pivoted over into writing after feeling less than inspired by law. With a newborn nearby, Mary successfully wrote and published two of her three published novels, Privilege and When You Read This. Her most recent publication, Palm Beach, was named the New York Post Top 30 Books of 2021. Congratulations. And she's also been reviewed by the Associated Press and printed in more than 13 countries. Currently, Mary is writing her first memoir related to her experience with miscarriage and helping her client list of creative leading women to write, revise, and pitch long-form narrative novels in her 12-month program, The Book Incubator. Mary, we're so happy that you could join us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And by the way, my I don't know why that's in my bio. My program is not just for women. It's for creative leaning all people. So yeah.
Hey, we love the inclusion.
Yes, yeah, just to be clear.
So today we're talking about traditional publishing, this is super exciting for Zach and I, because neither of us are traditionally published. We're both indie published. We recently did an episode on indie publishing, episode 30, if you guys want to go check that out. But today Mary's talking to us about traditional publishing. So we'll just dive right into our questions. First question is, did you always know you wanted to traditionally publish, and how did you decide?
You know, it's funny because I've worked with some writers who have indie published as well. And it's when they talk about why they indie published, it sounds a lot like why I traditionally published. It just seemed like they were like, I thought that this was just what you do. And that's kind of how I felt about traditionally publishing. I just thought, oh, that's what you do. You find a publisher. Like, it never occurred to me that I could be my own publisher. It just didn't even, it didn't feel like making a decision. It felt like, oh, I need to learn the way to do this. And I assumed that there was only one way to do it. And so that's what I fell into. And it worked out for me. And I'm very grateful that happened. But especially now in 2023, I'm so excited learning about alternate paths of publishing other than just traditional. And I do help writers who want to traditionally publish do that in my program. But yeah, I think it really wasn't intentional. It was just sort of falling into it.
Yeah, it is really interesting how how depending on what we already know about the publishing industry, that informs how we think about the possibilities and what we end up going for. That's super interesting. So when you decided to go that route of traditional publishing, how did you get a book deal? What was that journey like for you?
Long and hard. I don't even remember how I learned this. I think I took a class in how to get published traditionally. But I think it was just called How to Get Published. Again, I think there was just this understanding kind of in the writing classes I was taking that was just what you did. And so I learned I had to get a literary agent. So I started and I learned how to get a literary agent, which is to query them. So to send them basically a short email about your book. And so I started doing that in 2013. And I ended up signing my agent with my agent in 2016. So it took me 3 years and a lot of no's, a lot of rejection, a lot of reworking the manuscript. And it was just long, it felt interminable, but I didn't, again, it just didn't occur to me to go any other route. And there's also that phenomenon of a dog with a bone, it's once you start, you're I'm in this and I'm going to do it until I succeed, just not letting go.
Mm-hmm.
But once I got I signed with my literary agent in the end of 2016, I believe. Or was it? Yeah, 2016. It was all easier from there. So that was really the hardest part for me, because from there, I have since known writers who have gotten a literary agent who has sent out their books to publishers, and publishers have still all said no. So like they haven't ended up getting a book deal, which is super disappointing, of course. But luckily that did not happen with me. So after I was represented by this literary agent and we decided to work together, she sent out my book, HarperCollins, I ended up signing with HarperCollins, and then they published my next two books. So everything after that kind of fell into place pretty nicely.
That
Amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like that took a lot of patience.
Yeah. And like, it didn't even feel like patience as much as just massive insecurity and fraud syndrome, because I just think when you have, and when I work with writers now who are trying to traditionally publish, they go into this knowing I'm going to get a lot of rejection. But when it starts coming, they're like, this feels so much worse than I thought it was going to feel, because just when you're getting no. And sometimes, the thing about literary agents, have either of you queried literary agents? No.
Yeah.
Okay. I am in the process of querying my second novel. I've gotten one no so far.
Okay. So yeah, you're in it. And like, I don't know if your no was what the tone of your no was, but I feel like literary agents can be extremely direct in a way that feels pretty brutal. Like a writer forwarded me this week a rejection she got. She said, I got to be honest, this one really stings. And it was just kind of brutal. It was like, you don't, I wasn't compelled by this story. You don't do XYZ. And it's just, it kind of, they can speak to you in a way that, like, even when we get feedback from each other as writers, we don't often speak in language that's quite that harsh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just gets under your skin when the agents do it.
Yeah. So I think that's what it felt like it took. Less patience and more just like thick skin. Like, oof, I got to shake that one off and keep going,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like you've already addressed this a little bit, but how would you recommend our listeners go about getting a book deal if that's what they're wanting to do?
So if they want to do that, I do recommend trying to get an agent. That said, increasingly I'm finding there are smaller publishers, independent publishers that accept what they'll call unrepresented manuscripts. So they'll accept manuscripts directly from writers. And I don't think that, I think that can also be a great way to go, because it's basically, I do kind of picture, sometimes, they call agents the gatekeepers, and I do sometimes picture it like a series of gates you're trying to get through. And if you start to also send your book out to these smaller independent publishers, you're basically skipping over one of the gates, like you don't need to find an agent, and like, you just need to find a publisher. And they can be some really good publishers. Like I live in Nashville, and there's a publisher here, Harpeth Road Press, which is pretty new. It only opened in the last couple of years. And they accept unrepresented manuscripts, and it's all digital. So it is digital publishing. They do have some print on demand, but mainly they'll publish your book digitally. And then like the arrangement is a little bit different than it often is for the kind of the quote unquote, the big five publishers, they sometimes call them.
Mm-hmm.
the really big players in the traditional publishing industry. So like their contracts at Harpeth Road are I think she pays 30% or 35% royalty, which is really high. So like my royalties with HarperCollins are anywhere from like 5 to 12%, depending on the kind of book that's sold and how many copies I've sold. But so 35% is quite high. But so it's just like a different, but I think she pays a much smaller advance. And then the big publishers often pay bigger advances. But 90% or more, no, I think it's higher than that. It's at least 90% of authors do not earn out their advance.
Mhm.
So that, I think that's a really important data point to know for anyone who's going to try to traditionally publish, because basically what you're getting for your advance, if you go with one of these bigger publishers, not the smaller ones, but if you go with the bigger publisher, unless you are in the 10% of people this is not true for, your advance money will be the money that you make on the book. You're not going to make more. So like,
Right.
I just think that's really important to know. I didn't know that. Like, yeah, I had no idea. I've only realized that in the last year or so. But if you go with a smaller publisher, that doesn't apply.
Mhm.
Because that data point is really just about the big publishers. So all of that is to say, to answer your question, yeah, I recommend trying to get a literary agent. And the way to do that, I mean, even just Googling like how to get a literary agent, you'll get some good information on that. I have a YouTube channel with a few different videos on how to do that if people want to look that up. But it's basically writing a cold email describing you, describing your book to agents who represent books like the one you wrote. And that's really important. I didn't understand that either at first. That's probably another reason it took me 3 years. At first, I was querying like a contemporary fiction novel that has some romance in it to an, you know, you don't want to query that to an agent who represents fantasy like that. That's
Right.
not a fit, you know? So like you do need to look up to see who the agents represent. And there's some really good sites for this. Readsy has a really good list. Query Tracker, it's called, has a really big database of agents and the kinds of books they represent. So there's some really good free information out there.
That's
Nice.
awesome.
So you mentioned some resources for finding the agents. What sort of resources would you recommend for finding these small publishers that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure there are other ones too, but the one I found recently that I thought was really great, I think was also on Readsy. Readsy is just a really great site, you know, that has all kinds of information, but they had a list of smaller and independent publishers and linked to their website and put whether they accepted unrepresented manuscripts. And it was just like a really nice, easy place to find a bunch of smaller publishers and kind of check them out and see if they look like they might be a fit.
Very cool. You talked again a lot about agents, and I was wondering what the relationship between the author, the agent, the publisher, and the editor, how that goes, and how much choice you have in choosing your publisher and editor.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So, also, I didn't know this until I was really in it. So once you have a literary agent, your literary agent is going to send your book out to editors that the agent knows might be interested in the book. And these editors they're synonymous with publisher. Like when we say like, for example, my agent only sent my book to one editor at HarperCollins. She wouldn't have sent it to a couple of editors there because they're not going to compete against each other for a book. So it's like when she says she sent it to certain editors, that means she sent it to one editor at every publishing imprint. So you could either say like, I sent it to HarperCollins or I sent it to Emily at HarperCollins, but either way, it means the same thing. So, but it does go, she did send it to different imprints at the bigger publishing houses, which is a little bit confusing. So when they say like the big 5 publishers, it's Penguin, Simon and Schuster, Hachette, Random House is the same as Penguin, HarperCollins, and what's the 5th one? Anyway, it's 5, but each of them have their imprints. So they have a bunch of, imprints underneath the umbrella. And so the agent will send your book out to individual editors at different imprints. So like at Simon and Schuster, several different imprints could get your book. And then if more than one wants it, this is sort of a dream scenario, it'll go to auction. And then basically they kind of bid against each other for your book, and that increases your advance size. So they will start, your agent will kind of call and say, oh, Penguin offered us this much. Do you want to match it or go higher? And they'll say yes. And then your agent will go around and do that until the people start dropping out and you end up with a couple of with one or two kind of like highest bidders. And in my case, that did happen with my first novel, and I ended up with two publishers who both were willing to pay the same advance amount. And so then it became about like, who did I just want to work with, or what publisher did I want to go with? And in terms of the author's say, you make the final decision, you get to make the final decision. Like, I didn't even have to choose the highest bidder in the auction. I could have said, oh, actually, even though Simon and Schuster only offered half as much, I've always wanted to be published by Simon and Schuster, so I want to go with them, and like your agent like will totally defer to you as the author on that. There's also an opportunity during that process where you get on in my case, it was on the phone. I've known writers, if they happen to be local, like in New York or where a lot of agents are on the West Coast, who will be invited to, where a lot of publishers are, they'll be invited to the publisher's office to meet face to face to like talk about the book before they have to agree to go with that publisher. In my case, it was on the phone, but I talked to each of the editors who was interested in my book and got to have a conversation about what their vision was for it. And I think that's really nice because you get a real sense of people's vibe. And so in my case, when it came down to the two different editors, because I had spoken to both of them on the phone, I knew immediately who I wanted to go with, because it was like, oh, I had a really good conversation with Emily, her name's Emily, who turned out to be my editor. And so I was just very excited because I really felt like she and I had the same vision for the book. And then at that point, once you have a book contract, you're pretty much working with your editor. So it like, you don't want, and this was interesting. We kind of had to feel this out in my case because I was a new author and I wasn't quite sure, like, who should I be sending my drafts to? Who should I be getting notes from? But basically my takeaway in my experience was like, you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, like the editor's job at that point is to edit. So even though your agent up until this point has probably been giving you notes and stuff, once you sign with the publisher, the agent falls back a little bit on the notes front, because the editor's job is to give you notes. And like, that's the person who, it's basically just like division of labor. Like, this is my area, right. That's your area. So then you start working with the editor. And I often have been asked, what do you do when you disagree? Or like, what do you do when you're asked to do something with your book that you don't want to do? Luckily, that did not happen that's never really happened for me. I mean, it's felt a lot. I worked with the same editor for all three of my novels, and it felt, all three of them, it felt a lot more collaborative. It's not like she would come to me and be like, you have to make this change. She would come to me and say, hey, I'm thinking, what if you do this? And here's my reasoning. What do you think of that? And then I'd be like, oh, I like that, but here's what I would do differently based on your reasoning. What if we did this? So it's like, it feels a lot more collaborative than like, you must make this change because I'm the publisher. Like, it never had that vibe at all.
That's really good to hear.
That lets out a lot of I know that for some writers, there is an anxiety that comes with going traditionally published, where there's the fear of losing control over your manuscript or your baby, right? Because it needs to fulfill the purposes of the editor and the publisher in competing inside of the market, kind of thing. So it's really interesting to hear that with your experience, it was a lot more collaborative and focused on the book itself rather than the environment that the book is going to go into.
Yeah. And it was, and it's interesting because I've wondered, like, did I just get really lucky that I had an editor who really wanted me to be happy, and like, that's possible. But I remember now, I had a bunch of anxiety about that with my first novel, because it was my first book. Like you said, I hadn't done this before. Was a little nervous about how much control I was ceding, but it also had drawings. So that book had about 75 drawings in them, and they were a really important part of the storytelling. And when I got the first draft of the layout of the book, where it was like, my editor sent me, she's like, this is what we've laid out. What do you think? So just to set the context, when I sent the manuscript off, both to my agent and when we sold it, every drawing had one full page. And it was almost, it was intentional. It was almost like a children's book where like, I only want the reader to see one thing at a time, and then like turn the page and see one thing at a time, and then see some, like it was almost like a visual poem or something in that way. Like you can't. So then when I got the layout, there were 4 of them on a page to save page. So it was almost like a graphic novel, or like and a cartoon or something. And so like they were small and like in these quadrants. And I remember my heart was racing. I was like, no. Like that is just so far from the story I was telling, where like a reader would look at the page and see 4 things at once. And I remember writing kind of a panicked email to my editor. And I think I even said like, this is a hill I will die on. Like it was a little dramatic. Because she wrote back, she's like, you don't need to die on any hills. Well, it's fine. Like, she's like, I'm just trying to keep the page count down, but like, let's try 2 to a page and see what you think. So then we did 2 to a page, and I was like, okay, that's fine. So that was like a compromise, but yeah, I remember being that was a really scary moment.
Yeah, and in that case, I can totally get where you're coming from, because I think about the invention of Hugo Cabret, right, where you have these sections of prose interspersed with the pictures, and it would be so different if the pictures were set up so that you had 2 or 4 to a page, right? It would be a very different experience.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, as the writer, you're like, I created this experience for you, and you want it to look like what you created. And ultimately, I mean, there was another time too, it ended up, I don't remember what it was, but I remember my editor saying, you're the author and it's your call. And that was a really interesting moment too, because speaking of the default things that we assume, I think I always assumed that like once you had a publisher, it was their call about certain things. And that was basically her being like, it's actually not. Like, your name's on the cover. We're going to tell you what we think, but if you want to do it this way, you can do it this way. And that was like, oh, it felt kind of nice to realize, like, I mean, I'm sure there are aspects over which the author's not in charge, right? Like I got to weigh in on my cover design, but ultimately I don't know that they would have let me design the cover. Like, probably not, nor should I have. But like in terms of the writing itself, it was clear that like ultimately since my name was going on it, I would have to be the one to make the call.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
We probably have time for maybe one more quick question in this episode, which I hate to cut it short because this is such a good talk. But Zac, do you want to choose the last question?
Yeah, I am really curious about what the marketing side looks like when you go traditional publishing, because I've heard conflicting things. My expectations have been one thing, and I've heard other things about what role the publishing house plays in marketing and selling your book. So could you talk a little bit about that aspect of your experience?
Yeah, I think I thought like I was going to be sent on a book tour, which no. They actually, my publisher was very helpful in arranging a book tour, but they don't pay for book tours anymore unless you're like Stephen King or something. So I did go on one. I had to fund it all myself. I did have a publicist for each of my books, and they really sort of, basically, they kind of helped me get on like podcast spots, or like with my first book, it was HarperCollins has an arrangement with LitHub where like authors can write an essay about writing their book and it'll go up on LitHub. So like there are some helpful things like that. But what I didn't realize, that now is like, I wish I had known this, is most of their marketing efforts are spent on bookstores, not readers. Like they're trying to get Barnes and Noble to buy a bunch of your book and put it on a table in the front.
Mhm.
They are not marketing directly to readers. That's going to be Barnes and Noble's job, right? Like it's a chain, and it's like publisher, bookseller, reader, and they're marketing to the bookseller, not the reader. So in that sense, I looking back, I think I did not realize how much the marketing to actual readers was something that I should have been doing more of as the author. I mean, I was doing my best. I like was posting on my little Instagram account where it's just my friends and family following me. Like I was,
Right.
but you know, in retrospect, like, and what I tell writers now, I actually think it's really savvy to plan to market yourself, because like I said, they're marketing to booksellers. They're not marketing to readers very much for you. So you gotta, it's almost like if you get your advance, I think it's smart to set aside some of that advance to plan to do some marketing to readers, like whatever that means, you know, whether that's going on a book tour or hiring a publicist or just having some basically marketing spend that you can do to market your own book, because traditional publishing is not the solution for marketing. Like I thought that too. I've heard people say like, well, smaller publishers don't help you market. Big publishers don't help you market either. I mean, like I said, a little bit, but they have so many books coming out, and my publicist and the marketing team, they were always so lovely. But it's also like, I don't even know the numbers, but they've dozens and dozens of books coming out, and they're like these little marketing departments. Like, of course, they just don't have the resources to be like, we're going to get Mary's book out in front of everybody. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much because that answers a lot of my questions about how that all works out. Before we wrap up, how can our listeners find you if they want to find out more about your program, find your books? How can they find you?
Yeah. So my website is maryadkinswriter.com, and it's Adkins with a D like dog. Not D like the diet from the 90s. So it's, yeah, maryadkinswriter.com. And the program I run is called the Book Incubator. So they could also go to thebookincubator.com if they just want to learn about that particular program.
Perfect.
Awesome.
We'll just put those links in the caption.
Yes.
Yes. Perfect.
Thank you so much, Mary, for coming on. We will see you in our next episode as well, which is so exciting. But this has been Quid Pros Quo. Thank you so much for listening.